In the 2 weeks since the Oval Office clash between President Trump and President Zelensky, the geopolitical landscape has shifted dramatically. What started as a tense negotiation over minerals in the U.S. support for Ukraine, it spiraled into a full-blown crisis. The fallout sent shockwaves from America to Ukraine to Russia to the European Commission. But recent developments suggest a potential de-escalation, with a ceasefire now in play and tangible steps towards peace, though the road ahead remains treacherous. If we rewind to late February, the Oval Office meeting started with strained civility but quickly devolved. Vice President Vance and Zelensky traded shots while Trump, incensed by Zelensky's defiance, accused him of gambling with World War III and disrespecting the U.S. office before abruptly ejecting him from the White House with a parting shot saying he can come back when he's ready for peace. Days later, Trump froze military aid to Ukraine, declaring no more blank checks. Russia seized the moment, with Dmitry Medvedev gloating over the West's chaos and Putin eyeing new opportunities in the Donbass region. By March 9th, Ukraine's position looked dire. Zelensky crisscrossed Europe, securing pledges of financial aid from Germany and France, while Poland hinted at bolstering its border defenses. Yet, Europe's resolve wavered. Hungary's Orbán tilted towards Moscow, and Italy hesitated over the costs. Without U.S. firepower and partial commitment from the EU, Ukraine was on the brink. Fast forward to March 13th, and the script had once again flipped. After talks in Saudi Arabia, Ukraine agreed to a U.S.-proposed 30-day ceasefire, covering the entire conflict, from front lines to back. The Trump administration, in turn, lifted its aid freeze, resuming military and intelligence support. In response, Putin gave a guarded nod, saying that he absolutely supports the ceasefire idea in principle, but only if it leads to lasting peace and tackles the conflict's root causes, like Ukraine ceding territory and dropping their NATO ambitions. Putin was adamant about preventing Ukraine from rearming during the 30-day reprieve and questioned who would enforce the ceasefire. So what's next? Could the two nations agree to a ceasefire? Maybe. But with Putin's demands, including Crimea and the Donbass region, along with no NATO membership, and a leash on Ukraine's military, I have my doubts. However, if the ceasefire fails for any reason, escalation is back on the table. If the U.S. stays involved, Trump will also have to escalate or risk looking weak. Meanwhile, Europe, following through on its threats, could go all in, shifting from supplies to boots on the ground, at which point NATO's Article 5 could trigger fast, and World War III stops being hyperbole. Joining me now is Adam Zivo, a journalist, researcher, and expert on Eastern European affairs. He's been closely following and reporting on the Russia-Ukraine war, along with its geopolitical fallout. Adam, thanks for being here.
Thanks for having me.
So you've spent a lot of time in Ukraine, and I wanted to start to, get into this by maybe explaining to the audience a story that, or a scene that you've seen that really sticks with you that Canadians just don't know of because they've never heard it in the news.
Well, so I first went to Ukraine at the very beginning of the war back in 2022, and I arrived in Kyiv 2 weeks after the area around that city was liberated. And I followed volunteers as they went and cleaned up kindergartens that had been damaged by the Russian occupiers. And one story that always stands out to me on a very emotional level is that I went to this one kindergarten, all of the windows were destroyed. You had children's toys and picture books that were pockmarked with shrapnel and bullet holes. You had little children's shoes on racks covered in shattered glass, and it was devastating to see. And I remember when I was there on the second floor, I saw a pile of paper butterflies that had been cut out. And then I noticed that halfway, across the windows, they had taken these little butterflies and put them on strings and hung them. It was an art project. But the Russian occupiers came in and that project was aborted. So you had these little children, kindergartners, who one day were decorating their classroom and the next day were made into refugees in Poland and other parts of Europe. And these are the kinds of stories that people who are on the ground and everyday Ukrainians are intimately familiar with. And they know what it's like when the Russians come. They know what life is like under occupation. Many of them have families who are under occupation, and they've seen the images of the mass graves of the civilians who have been murdered in the streets. And so when Westerners talk about making peace with Putin, Ukrainians often find that tone deaf because Westerners don't have an understanding of what's at stake here. Should Ukraine be dismembered, and should Ukrainians be left under Russian rule?
That's quite haunting. I can only imagine what that was like to see. And I couldn't agree more. I think that we sort of lose touch with the reality of war when we can sit back here in Canada or in the United States and try to make these decisions, right? So I can certainly empathize with that situation. And that's why I kind of wanted you to paint that picture for the audience. I wanted to start there because you've been there. And I feel like it gives a little more visceral feeling to really what's going on. So I appreciate that.
Mhm.
Okay, we'll be right back.